Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for attending today's faculty training. I'm Misty Foster. We are very excited to have Dr. Rob Reynolds here today from NextSpot. And also, I'd like to add that please be sure to sign the sign-in sheet outside because we do have a couple prizes towards the end. You'll want to be in the drawing for that. But I'd like to invite Dr. Dennis Williams to come say a few things about Dr. Reynolds.
Well, it's a real pleasure for me to have the Online Resource Center invite Rob Reynolds to come to speak to us today and present. I met Rob last spring, or this past spring, I guess it was, at an education reform luncheon downtown, and we kind of hit it off, and Rob invited me to come down to the current business he's working with, which is NextSpot, which is kind of on the campus of Oklahoma University, and they're doing some real innovative kinds of technology, teaching, innovation kinds of things that really probably are the sort of next wave in designing online education. And so I'm real interested in those sorts of things. Rob earned his PhD at the University of Texas. Many of you OU fans probably won't hold that too much against him because he spent much of his career at the University of Oklahoma. He's been a traditional teaching faculty member early in his career, primarily teaching languages and literature. But then he shifted into administration and became the director of information technology at OU. He's also worked as a textbook publishing executive at Sinaj Learning, and so you can begin to see some trends here, right? IT plus content integration and those kinds of things start working together. In 2004, he founded or co-founded Explana, which was an educational tech startup, and has been working in research and blogging and publishing in the field of ed tech for more than a decade now. Rob is the author of The Future of Learning Content in 2012 and currently serves as the Chief Product Officer for NextSpot, where he blogs actively about connected learning and student engagement. And just many of those blog posts pop up on my feed on LinkedIn, and it's been real interesting to see in the course that he's been teaching in educational technology to see the kind of stuff that is coming out of his mind. And so it's a real pleasure to have Rob here. And if you would please join me in welcoming Rob to SNU.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thanks everyone for being here, taking time out of your schedules on a Friday to come, and for anyone who's out here watching me mess up the technology as I try to share my screen, and we'll get going. So, as Dennis said, we met last spring at an event and got to know each other a little bit and realized we were kindred spirits. We've had a number of great conversations, and one of the key threads that has gone through our conversations is how do we teach, how do we learn, how do we continue to address students as they continue to evolve, as they get younger every year, at least that's what it looks like to me. When I first came to Oklahoma in 1990, it just seems like a long time ago now, I taught at Oklahoma Christian, and just left the University of Texas, and I'd never been to Oklahoma really before. I had an aunt and uncle from Ponca City, and I came here and I thought, wow, this is what Oklahoma is, right? And I was telling Misty the time I taught there, and I've lived in Oklahoma mostly since then. My wife and I moved to Missouri for about 5 years when my startup was acquired. But in all that time, I would pass through here. I'd be in Bethany for a reason. I was telling Dennis this earlier, I would always see the campus, and I was thinking, man, I should go over there sometime. And you know, in a career, and some of you may have this experience, where you're on campuses a lot, or you're around, you go to conferences, you go to speak, you go to do that. And I've been really blessed all over the world to go to different campuses. Sometimes you think, yeah, I'll get to that, but I never did. And so I was telling John, who came with me today, as we parked and we were walking in a neighborhood and we were walking through campus, I was going, wow, I can't believe I haven't been on this campus. This is beautiful. It's just such a great It made me feel like I was in a university. So many times I go to a university, I don't feel like I'm at a university. I don't know where I am. And Southern Nazarene really has a feel of learning, the old, the new. It's really spectacular. Today I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about student engagement, and it's kind of the term I guess I would use to talk about how I think learning evolves and how we can transform what we think about in teaching and learning, no matter where we're at and what we're kind of into. We're going to spend the first part, so don't get frustrated with me, kind of framing the conversation, and at the end we're going to get into some very practical things. We'll be doing that all along the way. What I found is if I start off with the really practical things, it's we don't have a common language or framework to talk about those in, and some of you may end up tuning out, and this will give us a chance to kind of discuss a few things philosophically. I always like to begin presentations with a constraint exercise or an improv. And so we're going to do one. You need to turn to a partner. Only one of you has to be able to talk, so if you're chewing, just get somebody who isn't chewing right now. And we're going to do this, and if you're online, you can do this on your own. It's very simple, and we're going to play a little video that's going to walk us through it. So this is an improv that I actually would use in face-to-face classes all the time. In fact, one of the things you're going to hear me say toward the end is this is one of the, if you want to really encourage student engagement, one of the easiest things to do in your in-class or hybrid or online courses is to create constraint activities. It's the way we actually function in the real world. That's how we design software at my company every day. Everything's a constraint exercise, and as we talk about this, you'll start going away from here thinking, well, my whole life is a constraint exercise. I'm improving everything that I do. But it is a fantastic way to work with learners because it makes them see things differently. And we all know that until we get them to do that and change their assumptions and change the framework in which they see things, we're often not very successful in helping them get what we want them to. So find a person. We're going to start. You're going to have 30 seconds. And just follow along. The technology fairies working here. Will audio work?
Improvisation with an object. For this improvisation, I'm going to show you an object. It's something you've likely seen before. After I show the object, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write down as many things as you can think of that this object might be.
So write down.
The only restriction is that you can't write down what the object actually is. That is what you know. Okay, are you ready? I'm going to show you the object, give you 30 seconds, and you're going to imagine and write down all the things it might be. Here we go.
Write down everything that it could be except what it is. Talk with each other, get ideas, throw them out. Stop.
Time to share your answer.
Okay. All right, you got 30 seconds. I know it kind of ran quickly. Now you're here, so you probably didn't get 100 things. You can get one or two. And that's it. So we're going to go around. This is what in class while we're doing this. So anybody, first thing that you have? Bowl. A bowl. Okay. A particular kind of bowl or just a bowl? All right. No, you get lots of points for a bowl. I'm just okay. Yeah. All right. Somebody else. Plate. All right. All right. It's kind of like a family feud. Correct. All right. There's no wrong answers. That's a great thing. All right. You guys in the back. Petri dish. Okay. Let's see. You must teach philosophy. There you go. Spoken like a true academic. I love it. All right. Probably gonna have it with all sorts of things, but all right. Play one on TV. All right. What?
A kettlebell.
A kettlebell. That's awesome. All right, and that's very contemporary. It's one that we've written out, and as we do CrossFit, we've done our different workout things. We got kettlebells now. What else?
A button.
A button. I love buttons. Button's great. What else? Hat. Absolutely. Good French. Good lollipop. A lollipop? Excellent. I love it. A universe that has planets on it. Oh, it had planets. Cool. All right. Now we're jumping out. I like that. More abstraction. Good stuff. In the back, you guys have some brilliant things.
Actually, everything I said, they were.
Okay. They're brilliant, and you're doing it with the all brilliant group. I love that. We are affirmers in the back. We affirm everything. Great. I love acronyms. All right. Anything else? It's fun. We're not going to belabor this. But anything else that you came up with? No mushrooms. Wheel. Okay, wheels are good. That's a good one. So, you got wheels, mushrooms, flying saucers. Clown nose is one that I've gotten a lot. Ear. You know, it depends. Always. Now, what's interesting about an improv exercise like that, and we'll get into it more later, is all about what you bring to the table, where you're coming from, and about the constraints. And notice the constraints that I put on that. Get 30 seconds. Can be anything except what it is, etc. Now, I do this in face-to-face, and it also works. So I have rules when I show things. They have to be able to work in any environment. So normally, this is obviously something that I would do in face-to-face classroom. I do it on my online classes as well. So I use constraint exercises, and I do it in hybrid classes. Sometimes I do them face-to-face, and then they'll practice them later, depending on, sometimes they're very elaborate, and sometimes they're small. But constraint exercises are fantastic because they work in any learning environment, and they work in any discipline. No matter what you teach, you can devise very clever constraint exercises for 30 seconds, for 5 minutes, and we'll do some more in here, etc. And it's the easiest thing that I've ever come up with to be able to do both small thinking, just to get things started, elaborate problem solving. In my when I used to teach advanced and composition classes at the University of Oklahoma, if you ever take an advanced language class, they tend to be a lot about talking to students and reading things and not speaking the language. And unfortunately, we kind of developed a pedagogy around that. Doesn't make any sense, right? We're giving people 3 hours of credit to learn how to speak in an advanced conversation class. The instructor talking is there talking to the students. Doesn't really change that. So how do we get students to talk? So I started working, again, my philosophy with improv with students, and then I realized that was working really well. We had about 5, everything from improvisation, vocabulary to objects to scenarios. And I thought, hey, let's get crazy. So we started improvising little scenarios, and then we turned that into a soap opera. So what the course became was a structured set of constraint activities that trained them to start building a soap opera, so that the last 2/3 of the class, the whole class was building and producing an improvised soap opera in every class period. So we went from less than 10% of students speaking in class and learning to over 90% of students speaking in class. We more than tripled the actual achievement of the students. And I did literally less than 1/10 of what I used to do. I worked less than I ever worked in my life. My students were all stars, and I did nothing. I thought, oh, this is going to be a great thing. I'm going to do this for a living. I'm working so hard. But it was fantastic. In those classes, at the end, we always have kind of a final week where we would do like we were doing a soap opera, we would do a cruise ship theme or something that they all invented all of this, and the web came along, they would have to put the stories on the web, etc. They could invite friends. And so we always have to take our 25 student class and put it in a 200 student auditorium so that they could get all their friends in it. They would perform these things. Now, imagine the impact on their language skills and what they were doing and everything that was happening, but because we changed this a little bit. So I just give you an idea of all the many ways that these things can happen. So the question is, what is student engagement? Now, the funny thing is, we all have lots of ideas about what it could be. Now, you just heard me talking about improvs, and you could think, okay, well, that's what he thinks it is. It's a lot of things. And we all have these questions. What is it? Why does it matter? Do I have to change anything? Right? Who's responsible for it? How do you measure it? That's always a big deal, right? So one thing I used to always think, if I get students involved in whatever they're doing and they're become engaged, well, at the end of the day, how do I measure what they do? So we have a lot of questions. And because we have a lot of questions, guess what? We have a lot of different answers. And none of us seem to be saying the same thing when we talk about student engagement. It's what I've noticed as I go around and talk to people around the nation, or talk to people at different universities, and I'll ask, well, we want to get students more engaged. That means something to everybody. And so we come up with lots of different answers. One of them is student engagement is interaction with course assignments. So for some people, engaging students is about them doing a higher percentage of the work that they're assigned. Now, I think all these are right answers, by the way, not wrong answers. I'm just saying that is an answer that people commonly give to this question. So, for some people, student engagement is that they are going to be engaged in the course and the material outside of the classroom. For some of us, so we're all trying to solve different problems, right? Some of us are trying to solve the problem of, my students seem to be engaged here, but I don't think they think about this again. It's like, class is like a broken neon sign, right? It comes on at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it goes off, and it's never on again until the minute they walk in, and that's not learning, and I can't extend it. So the problem that student engagement, if we had student engagement, it would mean I could get them more involved outside of the classroom. For some think administrative one. Now, depending on the nature of your university, type of your students, this is a bigger or smaller problem. For example, at a large state university like the University of Oklahoma, this is the #1 question that's raised in any meeting beyond just a traditional faculty meeting. It's got to be on every agenda for every meeting that happens, because for every half of a point of retention that they improve, it's about $2 million back to the university. It's hard cash. So you're thinking, so every dean is under pressure, and every chair is under pressure, retention, and you've got all these students, and you know that you're only going to convert so many to go on past the freshman year, and so you're just trying to do better, trying to get from 14 or 15%, whatever it is, down a little bit in terms of how many you're losing. Now, with Southern Nazarene, certainly you always have retention issues, lower because you're faith-based connection to students, because of the reasons they're coming to school. They choose you purposefully and not just necessarily, I got the most money. There's often a family tie and a church tie, so that makes it a better. But for a lot of people, student engagement is more than what happens in the classroom. It's broader, right, in learning. For some, it's really a more holistic thing. If students are engaged, they're just going to learn more. I'm not trying to solve a specific tactical issue. It's strategic. If we can get students engaged, whatever that means, in learning, they're actually going to grow in knowledge and in wisdom, which is a good thing. And we all agree, all of these are good things. We want to have retention. We'd love for them to study outside of the classroom and to do 100% of their assignments in an engaged way and not just be checking off lists. I like this quote from Dave Cormier about this, about student engagement, and he says this, and I'm not sure I agree with all of it, but our job as educators is to convince students who don't care to start caring and to encourage those who currently care to continue caring. Now, Dave is a online education guru and works in that area and is a really passionate voice for not only educational technology but new forms of learning. And I agree with some of what he says. What's interesting is I still think his answer is at a very tactical level. He's saying we need to do certain things. We're trying to solve a certain problem, and I'm not sure we know what the problem is. What I do agree about student engagement that I think is important, we can all agree on, is that we all want to talk about it at some level. We all may think that if we did something, if we got students more engaged, I'm going to give you a list of things that may not resonate with each of you, but with some of you they will. My students might even like me more. They might like this class, maybe me. It's just they're not getting this class as much as they should. If they were just more engaged in the subject matter somehow, or with me, it would make a difference. And for others, it's we could really improve our department. We could do all these things. And what's true is, even though we don't have the same answer, I think student engagement creates a sense of a discussion. And we talk about it a lot in different ways, whether it's about collaboration, community, getting students to be active. We agree, all of us, even if we don't know what it is, that it's important. And it points to gaps because it assumes, this is a crazy thing about it, it assumes that there's something that's not happening. So student engagement is also positive, and yet sometimes we don't want to talk about it because when we do, it makes us think that we're not doing something right. And I would certainly want to dispel that. I don't think it's ever the case. I think it's there may be something else we could be doing. I think everybody in here is a passionate educator and committed human being to improving lives. Can't do any better than that. When we talk about student engagement, is different. It's a different problem. It's not just about caring. It's what can we do and how do we need to rethink the whole enterprise? Because the problem ultimately, I will argue, is not that any of us is doing anything wrong or needs a different technique or certainly not a new piece of technology. What's called upon is we're going to have to kind of reimagine what it is that we're doing in this enterprise we call education to begin with. We have to do a little bit of rethinking about learning. So go with me for a minute and think about education as a model in the United States. I would argue that if you wanted to design a model for learning, the very last thing that you would ever come up with is what we have. Now, this model, interesting enough, came out of a constraint exercise, a big national constraint exercise. We borrowed things from Great Britain, but we were a frontier country. That was one constraint. Well, how do we handle that? We have people spreading, and how do we manage education and keep kids learning? Even in an agrarian society, when the crops aren't being put out or brought in, how do we take advantage of those 4 months and give them something? Because we know reading and writing is important. That was a constraint exercise. We also had a constraint exercise because we had this notion that we had all these immigrants, and this is from the 19th century, and they spoke different languages and they had different heritages, and we needed a common curriculum. Back to the middle part of the 19th century, we need to kind of standardize what it means to be an American. Interesting. That's why I find that interesting, because when you hear political speeches, sometimes people think they're being original, and this is the things that we hear said are being said for hundreds of years in this country. And this one was a big deal. In fact, a lot of our public school movement grew out of this, right? And so it's not just enough to make sure that our kids out on the frontier have a one-room schoolhouse and they do this, but we need to educate all of our immigrants, and we need to have people get a common education. Well, but now you have this big spread out territory, so you can't depend on every family just to be doing a community doing natural learning thing. So you do what's normal. You establish artificial and arbitrary geographical locations, because that solved a problem, and you establish artificial and not arbitrary, but certainly artificial times that learning would take place. Well, when the parents are busy at work, so we'll have kids go, we'll get them taken care of. When they come back, they can be a family time. That makes perfect sense, by the way, if you set the problem up the right way. I would say that makes sense. And yet, it's absolutely contrary to how learning takes place. We're going to put a group of people in a strange place at an artificial time and say, learn this artificial thing out of context. And we're going to start them early. We want to start them when they're early so we can get it done, right? And so we created an absolutely centripetal model for learning that toward the center. We put everybody toward a place, and not just in a building, but we put them in a specific classroom with a specific teacher and in a specific subject, and we kept narrowing down and made this centripetal artificial construct for learning. And then we got so good at it in public school, we modeled this off of a variation of things that were happening in Europe. We really spread this in higher education, and then after World War II, and then the GI Bill and the Korean War and the GI Bill and the explosion of higher ed in the 60s, 70s, and on, we kept really focusing on this. And that's how we do education. It's the last thing any of us would design. We all know in the professional world, if we want to train someone to do something, what do? We're much more Socratic, very small groups, practical interaction, one-on-one teaching, tutorial method, we ask inquiry-based method, we do that. None of that lends itself to 25 to 300 kids in a room in a strange place. And it's always in the context of what you need to know, just-in-time learning, things that we all agree in, but how do you institutionalize that? So we created a centripetal model. The challenge in doing that is, and we identified a problem, and I'll do this because I skipped a slide, but I'll run through it because we keep thinking about this as it's got to be a technology problem, right? So we come up with different answers of how to solve it. So we're centripetal, now we've got to solve it, get student engagement. So what do? well, we could fix it with technology. I hope nobody believes that. I'm a technologist. I build educational software now, design it, and try to work in that space, and I have for a number of years. And that has never been a solution. Technology in education is anything more than a stick in the dirt. And that didn't solve education. Flannel graphs didn't solve education, for those of you back to your Sunday school days. Opaque projectors didn't solve education. They made it easier to share a book with people. They didn't solve anything. Overhead projectors didn't solve anything, and certainly not for left-handed people like me who smeared the ink when you wrote across them and kind of got embarrassed in front of all your fellow classmates. PowerPoint, boy, that solved education, right? This TV is solved. Computers, they're solving education. They're creating, no, they're actually, they're tools placed into an environment, and an environment amplifies the rules of the tool. So whatever the rules are, it just kind of amplifies the whole thing. In our centripetal model, we believe in bringing things to the center. We believe in isolating the learner, and it's all self-directed in a sense, no matter what we do, because that's what the models do. So we're fighting it. So every time we bring technology in, we just kind of make it more. We complain, well, the students don't connect with each other. I have news for everybody. The students were never connecting with each other. In higher ed, we put 25 people in a room, and they're all strangers, and we think that's community? That's going to make us all a group? I don't even care if we all went to church together. It doesn't. Systems take energy. They take lots of effort, and to get things to connect really takes a lot of work. It doesn't just happen, and especially not in the environments we've created. So it's not a technology problem, and it's not a subject area problem. It's not, we did it over here, and Rob did this in his language class, I heard, but that'll never work in chemistry. I've had the privilege to work with lots of people over pretty much every discipline I can think of, and who have done incredible things in student engagement, all with the same principles. So it's not a, but we tend to kind of go there. We think that it's an instructor problem. Well, I can do it, but I'm not like you, and so you may not be able to do that, or vice versa. He looks like he's gregarious and gets along with students, but I just kind of like to be more standoff. So there's nothing there for me, and that's not true. It's not an instructor problem either, and it's certainly not an institution problem. Every institution can do this. So getting back to what I was saying about the centripetal model, this is one that I like to share. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it's a great thing even if you are to review. So Georgia Land, right, was responsible for doing tests with NASA to try to identify innovative and creative engineers back in the 60s. And he did this with a lot of engineers, and you've seen there are about 280,000 adults over the years. And he thought, hey, this would be interesting to try out on kids, see how creative they are. And look at the results. So he did test on kids and then retested them every 5 years. So when they were 5, 10, and 15. So when they were 5, they all scored 98% on creativity. When they were 10, 30. Time they were 15, they were down to 12% on the same instrument. And the adults, of the 280,000 he surveyed, they were at 2%. And now the first thing we may say is, well, but we know kids, they have that imaginary thing. Okay, I'll take you 98 to 30 on that. But when we start getting down to 2%, I think Land's kind of, I think his summary of that is probably right. What we've concluded is that non-creative behavior is learned. Another way to say it is non-creative behavior is taught. It's structured. We build environments that don't foster and facilitate connection and creativity. And so how do we do that? How do we go from centripetal to centrifugal? And notice I seem to be a long way perhaps from student engagement as you think about, well, I just want to know some good tricks here, but it's fundamentally important that we see that we kind of have to reimagine the way we think about learning and what our goal is. So if you look at this diagram of nodes and you think about learning, I want you to think about, instead of the course being at the center of the universe, I want you to think of a student at the center of that universe. And I want you to think of learning in this way. What if our goal, and I could convince you, I probably can't today, but our goal was to say that we want to take that student at the center of that, and our goal in learning is to create as many connections as possible for that student in information and people. And the more we can get that student to engage and create new connections in that system, the more they're going to learn. So if that student's connected to a book and an instructor, no. That student's connected to a book, an instructor, and a mentor, more. To a group of people over here doing this, to practitioners, to a bunch of students who are really into this, to a family, etc. And all of a sudden, intuitively, that makes sense, I think, to us. That connections, both to information and people, reinforced matter. That's how learning takes place, and we know that through studies. That we talk about natural language learning or anything that kids do or that we've done. It happens in community. It happens with connection. It happens with multiple sources. And so one of the things we look at in student engagement is how do we reinvent our learning model so that we're opening up more opportunities for connection. That's the simple takeaway from this whole presentation. I would argue that if we want to expand student learning, we don't have to be overly innovative. We just kind of have to change our thinking. That the job, as I look at John over here, if you're one of my students, is not to make sure that John digests all of this information today to give it back to me, if you're one of my graduate students, to give it back to me at the end of the semester, only never ever to remember any of that or use it ever again. But change it from that job, and I'm going to do one thing, to say, rather, I want John to take this and I want the learning to endure with him for a lifetime, for generations, to share and to do it. But to do that, he has to be engaged. And I have to rethink, not necessarily the way I organize my classroom or anything, but that is what's important. So how am I going to get John connected to do those things? And how am I going to rethink learning in general? So student engagement isn't a quantitative problem, which we tend to think of. We like to think, well, student engagement is better test scores. I think we probably have a pretty good idea that better test scores are an indication of something. And in some courses, they're an indication more than others. But they're certainly not an indication, any indication of any learning that endures or any indication of wisdom, which I think would be particularly important to this group. Because I would argue that our goals here are not just to have people acquire information, it's transforming that information into knowledge and hoping to see that knowledge grow into wisdom. That is not something that comes in the traditional educational model. That is something that only comes through real student engagement, through connection, through community, etc. And so we ask ourselves, hey, how do we see things differently so that happens? And how do we do it fundamentally? Now, having said all that, I don't think I made it sound easy, but it sound like I think it's trivial. Oh, you just got to put your left foot over here and do that just like that. Learning is hard. It's my fundamental, I guess, belief after all these years of teaching, working, and doing research. Real learning, managing it is not easy. You all have favorite students, people that are just superstars that come through and have connections with that have gone on and been more successful than you probably and write you letters, and I do too, and that's just fantastic. But that's a small percentage. The real learning, getting what I said, from information to knowledge to wisdom, is not, we don't take it for granted, it's not simple. And so it's really hard, in fact. Institutions are horrible at it. In fact, institutions do a bad job of managing learning because that's not what, learning isn't about an institutional framework, it's about real people making real connections about passion and heart. It's not just about head. And if we don't do that and set up environments and structures to do that, we shouldn't be surprised that our students don't internalize the information, or the only ones that do are kids who are going to do it no matter where they went and they don't even need me. I'm just there to help them mind the time. I'm talking about everybody else that we can really help do that with. So it is hard. And so how do we make the shift? So I always like going to a comedian for some advice. I'll use George Carlin here to give us a little bit.
Just had, just kind of weird. Just had that little feeling. You ever get that funny little, that kind of feeling, that bourgeois day? You know, not deja vu, this is bourgeois day. This is the strange feeling that somehow none of this has ever happened before. And then it's gone, you know.
So what I want to think about for the rest of our time is both how do we reimagine what we do? Just like that improv exercise, we can think about it as everything, all these things except what we currently think it is. How do we change assumptions? And then how do we come up with a couple of things where we can start applying that? We really want to see this student engagement, this information to knowledge to wisdom happen. Bob Sutton wrote a book called Weird Ideas That Work, and he talked about Vujade in that. And in his discussion, he would say that Vujade is really about changing your assumptions. How many of you do you think, don't raise your hand, because I'm assuming it's all of you, go into your classrooms with some pretty traditional or just kind of common assumptions that you've developed over the years? And if you're like me, it gets harder and harder to even think about my students differently. I have assumptions about what will happen, how it goes, etc. And I have assumptions about what's going to happen in a faculty meeting. I know that so-and-so usually says this, so-and-so is always recalcitrant and will argue, they don't come around, and I just create these structures and I know how it's going to be, and nothing's ever going to change, so let's just have one. And I get all of that. So Vujade is important because it says, can you see something differently and change? So, for example, are the lines parallel? Some of you may be able to lose your visual assumptions and actually see those as parallel lines before I ever do that. Probably most of you can't. And what it requires is a constant refocusing and reanalysis, like every couple of seconds to do it. You just have to really shift, and then you get to where you can do that. Oh yeah, those are flat. But when you first see it, no, because you're carrying traditional assumptions and the way that things work, and you're using these same old kind of filters to look at things. So what we want to talk about is how do we see things differently? Now, it's not easy, even if you're an expert, because we all know that experts can't get out of assumptions either. I love this one. The Yale University management professor who told poor Fred Smith that overnight delivery service was a bad idea. You can't even get a C for an idea like that. And who would ever believe that overnight delivery service could work? And now we all say, who would ever believe that we could survive without overnight delivery service? We have to have it. And yet, we would assume that he was a Yale University management professor. He had appropriate titles from all the great places. He went to Yale or Princeton or someplace, and he was an expert in assumptions and couldn't see past them. I love the second one. We don't like their sound, and by the way, guitar music is a thing of the past. It's on the way out. So these Beatles, they don't have anything. The guy's family's still kicking themselves that he said that. Yeah, assumptions are hard. We make them all the time, so seeing things differently isn't easy. If you haven't seen this, I'm going to show it. I will take the time because this is good. This is about learning to see things differently, embracing new models.
So when I was in art school, I developed a shape in my hand, and this was the straightest one I could draw. Now, in hindsight, it was actually good for some things like mixing a can of paint or shaking a Polaroid. But at the time, this was really doomsday. This was the destruction of my dream of becoming an artist. The shape developed out of really a single-minded pursuit of pointlessness, just years of making tiny, tiny dots. And eventually, these dots went from being perfectly round to looking more like tadpoles because of the shape. So to compensate, I'd hold the pen tighter and just progressively made the shape worse. So I'd hold the pen tighter still. And this became a vicious cycle that ended up causing so much pain and joint issues, I had trouble holding anything. And after spending all my life trying to do art, I left art school, and then I left art completely. But after a few years, I just couldn't stay away from art, and I decided to go to a neurologist about the shape and discovered I had permanent nerve damage. And he actually took one look at my squiggly line and said, well, why don't you just embrace the shape? So I did. I went home, I grabbed a pencil, and I just started letting my hand shake and shake. I was making all these scribble pictures. And even though it wasn't the kind of art that I was ultimately passionate about, it felt great. And more importantly, once I embraced the shake, I realized I could still make art. I just had to find a different approach to making the art that I wanted. Now, I still enjoyed the fragmentation of things, seeing these little tiny dots come together to make this unified whole. So I began experimenting with other ways to fragment images so the shape wouldn't affect the work, like dipping my feet in paint and walking on a canvas. Or in a 3D structure consisting of 2x4, creating a 2D image by burning it with a blowtorch. I discovered that if I worked on a larger scale and with bigger materials, my hand really wouldn't hurt. And after having gone from a single approach to art, I ended up having an approach to creativity that completely changed my artistic horizon. This was the first time I'd encountered this idea that embracing the limitations could actually drive creativity. At the time, I was finishing up school, and I was so excited to get a real job and finally afford new art supplies. I had this horrible little set of tools, and yeah, I felt like I could do so much more with the supplies I thought an artist was supposed to have. I actually didn't even have a regular pair of scissors. I was using metal shears until I stole a pair from the office that I worked at. So I got out of school, I got a job, I got a paycheck, I got myself to the art store, and I just went nuts buying supplies. And then when I got home, I sat down and I set myself to test it. Really try to create something that's completely outside of the box. So I said, and nothing came to mind. The same thing the next day, and then the next, quickly slipping into a state of slump. And I was in a dark place for a long time, unable to create. And it didn't make any sense because I was finally able to support my art, and yet I was creatively blind. But as I searched around in the darkness, I realized I was actually paralyzed by all of the choices that I never had before. And it was then that I thought back to my jittery hand. I realized if I ever want my creativity back, I had to quit trying so hard to think outside of the box and get back into it. I wondered, could you become more creative then by looking for limitations? What if I could only create with $1 worth of supplies? At this point, I was spending a lot of my evenings in, well, I guess I still spend a lot of my evenings in Starbucks, but I knew you can ask for an extra cup if you want one. So I decided to ask for 50. I did it, turned the night over, and then with some pencils I already had, I made this project for only 80 cents. It really became a moment of clarification for me that we need to first be limited in order to become limitless. I took this approach of thinking inside the box to my canvas and wondered what if instead of painting on a canvas, I could only paint on my pen. So I painted 30 images, one layer at a time, one on top of another, with each picture representing an influence in my life. Or what if instead of painting with a brush, I could only paint with trotting stones? So I dipped my hands in paint and I just attacked the canvas, and I actually hit so hard that I bruised the joint in my feet and stuck straight for a couple weeks. Or what if instead of relying on myself, I had to rely on other people to create the content for the art? So for 6 days, I lived in front of a webcam, I slept on the floor, and I ate takeout. And I asked people to call me and share a story with me about a life-changing moment. Their stories became the art as I wrote them onto the revolving canvas. Or what if instead of making art to display, I had to destroy it? This seemed like the ultimate limitation, being an artist without art. The destruction idea turned into a year-long project that I called Goodbye Art, where each and every piece of art had to be destroyed after its creation. In the beginning of Goodbye Art, I focused on forced destruction, like this image of Jimi Hendrix, made with over 7,000 matches. Then I opened it up to creating art that was destroyed naturally. I looked for temporary materials, like spitting out food. Sidewalk chalk, and even frozen wine. The last iteration of destruction was to try to produce something that didn't actually exist in the first place. So I organized candles on the table, I lit them and then blew them out. Then repeated the process over and over with the same place. Then assembled the video into the larger image. So the end image was never visible as a physical film. it was destroyed before it ever existed. In the course of this goodbye arrow series, I created 23 different pieces with nothing left.
So, it gives you a good example of one way to really look at how do we make changes. Well, I think as he says, very often someone like me will come in, or you won't even know and say, we got to think outside the box to do that. We got to do something radically different. I'm going to suggest that we really don't. We can be like what Phil says, we can embrace the shape, think inside the box, and do small things that have big transformative powers. It's really about rethinking our content. It's about rethinking our students and how we do it. So the last thing I would say is, boy, we need a redesign of the institution or a redesign of the curriculum. We just need a redesign of our thinking and start small. And as we get small wins, all of a sudden, as you can see in the trajectory that Phil took, and it happens in our lives, one small victory, one small change that works says, oh, well, what about that too? But it's still within the box, so it's easy. It doesn't change my workflows. It doesn't change a whole lot about what I do. And so I'm going to suggest 3. And the first one I've already shared with you a little bit, and it's constraint or improv. I find this to be really a good way to do things, and I also find it to be the most useful if you train anyone in your classes who's going to go out and work in the real world. This is, in fact, the single best skill you can use. Because if they come work for me or any other business, and I've had the opportunity, the very deep blessing, to work at pretty much any kind of business, from a startup with 2 of us literally sitting there wondering what we were going to do for a living, to companies with thousands of employees and billions of dollars of revenue, and then from the male person all the way up to the executive. And I've seen it. I know what we hire and what we look for, and it's always the same. The way that people move up and the reason we hire them and the way they become executives and do well is because they can do constraint exercises. Because that's the ones who can move up, the ones who can't stay where they are. They can take a few things and limitations, as Phil did, and they can think, you know, it seems like we're defeated on this, but I got an idea. I think there's something else we could do with that. I think there's another way we could approach that. And that doesn't matter if they're working in a lab, a chemistry lab, it doesn't matter what job there is, they're the ones who can solve problems. And so constraint exercises work really well. I'm going to give you an example of 2, really. I'm going to talk quickly because of time. I'm going to give you an example of 2. This first one is GE. In the 1980s, or the 90s, GE decided, excuse me, the 80s, beyond 2000, decided we have to take this ECG, big thing, right, to do the heart stuff. You got to take this cardiogram thing that goes on the wall and has to be plugged in, all that, and we've got to start using it in rural China and rural India. So what costs $150,000 has to come down to $1,500. What we charge now $1,000 for someone to use, we have to only be able to charge $4 and still make money on it. It can't connect to electricity because where we're going to take it, they don't have it. You're on it. And there are no cars or trains going out there, so somebody has to be able to put it in a little backpack and throw it on their back and take it on a bicycle. So they go to the engineers and say, go. And a couple of years later, there's what they come up with. This was the commercial they rolled it out in India with the doctors. That is a constraint exercise. That's the same thing as my own frisbee thing. It's just in a different engineering opportunity. It's a different way to look at it. Some of you are familiar, may have been involved with the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011. And you may have known that at Fukushima, they had a nuclear reactor and it melted down, and there was radiation being out. And very commonly, which the government might do, the government's told the inhabitants that radiation levels were just fine. Nobody needed to panic, nobody needed to worry. Obviously, citizens worried, and that, well, how do we can't get any good information. So they called relatives. One of the relatives was Joy Ito, who's the director of the MIT Media Lab, and who had worked in, done work, entrepreneurial work in Japan. He said, well, let's call some friends. I'm an influential guy. So he started calling friends, and they said, well, we just need to get Geiger counters to them. So there's a problem. It's called supply and demand. We don't need a whole bunch of Geiger counters at any time in the world, so there's not a whole bunch of them to go buy. We get it at Walmart, and so, okay, that won't work. So how do we do this? So they got together, they created an open source circuit for Geiger counter to do this, how to measure it. They did a Kickstarter campaign to get the parts, get everything done, and get it bought, get it built by a company in Japan, given out to people, and created a software so it would hook up to an iPhone or any other cell phone with the GPS capability, so they could simply hang the device out the window of a car as they drove around, and the phones would beam all that information up to the satellite. It would go to scientists all over the world, and they had the most accurate information of what was happening in Japan. It was a constraint exercise. We don't have Geiger counters, we have phones, and we have some know-how. How do we build a radiation detection system, measurement system, that can get information to scientists all over the world in a month? And how do we help these people? How do we help our students think that way? That's the question. Constraint exercises. We'll do our second one very quickly. It won't take as much time as I normally would, but I do want to go through it. Just to start it, and then I'll share it. So this is a thing that I like to do, and this is, again, it's one that can be variations of it in any discipline, and it's a great group constraint exercise. We'll do it for about a minute. Usually I'll give a total of 5 minutes, which isn't enough to challenge them. So the game is, you're part of a team that's going to a new planet, and you're kind of these colonists who are going, and you've decided you want to change everything. You're going to create a new language. The rule is you can only use 25 words of the English language to make this new language. So you want to take 25 words through any combination of those words, you could say as much or as most meaningful things as you could possibly say. So what 25 words did you pick? Give it to another person, whoever you're with, or a couple of you get together. They give you about a minute, and just start writing down words that you think would
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, okay.
Well, you where it's also modify that, yeah.
Okay, I've gotten you into the exercise just enough where I think we can have a bit of a conversation about it. What are some things that you noticed right off about what kinds of words? What were you gravitating toward, or what did you think, oh, that could be important? What's that? It's feeling. Now, what's great about a good improv or constraint exercise is there isn't a right answer. And that's the other reason they're so powerful with your learners. Your students will love them, and they will become better people, is because they're not afraid of getting it wrong. The second thing is, they're things that are easy to model. And I'm not doing that with you normally. If I were doing this, I would be doing it along with you and going through it. I don't believe you ever do any exercises like this in class or recommended. I don't do it that way. Modeling is key. Sometimes they're much better at it than I am. That's even better than what happens. And this works again across all disciplines. You can imagine if you're teaching computer science, this is a great language constraint thing. You have certain functions that you can use in writing a language or using or solving a problem. You can work with chemistry and you're designing different pieces with it. You can do math. There are all kinds of fun things you can do with this. So we have words of emotion. It's also very personal. We tend to gravitate towards, you learn a lot about yourself. It's psychological things as well. So emotion, what else did you see that were important words? You thought about right off. descriptor, all right, that's important. I only got 25. How do I do that? And what kind of descriptors would be important? Simple, right? And this is true. I've done this for probably hundreds of people now, and most people do tend toward 1 and 2 syllable words. And simple building blocks to do complex things, and there's less abstract. And no right or wrong, that's a tendency. Anybody, this is always one that would be common here. I would imagine that many in this room, one word that you think would be God. That would be what deity represented. Did anybody think about gender? Yeah, if you had a way to show gender, that may not be important. Did you think about negative and positive? I gotta have a not or a yes or something so I can, that also amplified, right? We didn't do it long enough. Some groups will, I have a certain percentage of groups that always come back and use zero. They understand that they think the zero is a very powerful tool in terms of language and amplification, expressing all kinds of again, great thing is there's no right answers, but it talks a lot about team building, structuring, etc. And it's a constraint exercise. You have this. I usually get 5 minutes. You only get 25 words. You have to express as much as you can. And they learn about each other. They learn about their skills. And usually, depending on what class I'm doing it in, what I'm trying to do, we can do this for days on a linguistics class, advanced linguistics class, music, philosophy, all kinds of things, and it shares the point. Dan Meyer, who teaches math, or used to teach math in middle high school. He has a great blog called Die/Dan. There's now got his PhD at Stanford and done as many other things. Used to do, what would you do with this exercise? He put it on his blog, and this was one. He said, what would you do with this? You have these people in a grocery line, and this is the express checkout line. You have this person with a whole lot of groceries in the other line. What's the right answer? Which line do you give? So Dan did this, actually got about 1,000 different comments on it. But they went through, and those math people, well, so they went through and they worked it out. First, Dan just did through observation, and then talking to the managers and looking at all of their what statistics they were keeping, and said, okay, that's the right answer. And then they started modeling math problems around it, using their students. The correct answer, by the way, is all things being equal, always get in the line with the fewest number of people. Over time, it's like if you go to Vegas, all things being equal, you will always lose 3% on every dollar. You come back with 97 cents, $3 you spend. That's the average. Some people say, I want it like that. Good for you. But everybody else is going to lose. That's the house gets theirs. Here, all things being equal, that happens. But it's a real-life constraint and a production exercise. Again, now you're taking that same concept and turning into modeling and turning into real-life things that people can do. We won't do this one, although it's really funny. This is another type of what I call a completion exercise that's really good in constraint or improv. Take something that's incomplete. Without a right answer and have them complete it. There are many ways. It's a real-life solution. This is the one about solving the Geiger counter. You could have thought of many ways to do that, but it's a way to express. We don't want to control thinking and connections. Remember, it's that network. We want people to connect in as many powerful ways as possible. So in this one, actually, what I do is it's a sportscast, it's a newscaster who does not understand what a word means. And so he says to a person on a remote, a young woman, and they don't know each other well other than the way relationship you would have, so they're not friends or not dating or anything. He's heard a word and he thinks it means one thing, so he says, while we're waiting, let's just canoodle a little bit while we're doing this. He said it's on live, public TV. She hears that and understands what canoodling, and she goes, what? No, there will be no canoodling here. And says that back to him. And then he says, oh, I thought canoodling meant, and I cut the audio. And then there's a conversation, and the class says, okay, what did he say? And create the image. So a great completion, so we have constraint can be either improv can really be about constraint or completion. So completion is the other thing you can do. And these are great ways to do real life things, but also to add other things about what you do with anything you're doing. You get a piece of it and to make it fun like that. That's a great, anytime you can take something where somebody's talking about it and cut the audio and have them do the rest, then you find one that works really well. So the step one of creating student engagement, creating connection, is about rethinking the types of activities you give your students. And I will tell you, it doesn't matter what discipline you teach, it doesn't matter whether you teach online, hybrid, or in class, all these things work by doing in every one of those environments with huge success with 20 people to 1,000. They work well. You have to design a little differently, but they're easy and they're fun. It's so much fun to have students get excited about something you're teaching, and they're not afraid of it being wrong. They're just kind of coming up with really cool things. Sometimes they come up with things, or a lot of times, that we haven't thought of. The second thing is presenting information differently. One of the biggest problems that we have is we are stuck presenting information the way that it was presented to the 2 generations before us. That's presented. We don't have to keep doing it this way, folks. We have better ways. The way two ways we generally present information are reading and talking. Both of those are passive. Talking, at least we can have to make. But reading is probably reading a traditional passage from a book is one of the worst ways, and the poorest. It's the lossiest system of presenting one thing, a piece of information in a package, over to someone and thinking they're going to get anything that's worthwhile. Because it requires so much effort from the receiver to do it, because it is not engaging. It doesn't really. So from the minute that it starts, I open to page 33, and immediately it's like that new car. It lost 45% of its value the minute that the page is open. And then you go down the first paragraph, and you see somebody walk in front of you, and then it goes down another 30%, and it goes on. Are we training students to do something? Yes, but it's a bad way of getting information to them. So one of the easiest ways to solve information, especially around reading, is to reshape reading. This takes a little work, but it's not hard to rethink it. So in our Power of Connections course, one of the ways we model this is through dialogue. Socrates and Plato certainly believed in this. It works very well. We try to always present initial concepts. At the very least, if we're going to do a reading, we present it in the form of a dialogue. Now, we can do that in video, we can do it in writing, etc. And why dialogues? Because immediately, even though it's still passive, it's a form of participation. I'm participating in the discussion at the same level I'd be if 2 people were talking and I wasn't really talking it, but I'm hearing. I'm more engaged because I'm interested. There's something happening here. When one person, especially an academic or a person in the other profession who's written a textbook, is writing an explanation of something, I will argue that nobody really wants to hear that. No one wants to. We have to. Nobody wants to. We can take that same information and change the structure slightly, and then people go, oh, I wonder what they're talking about. I wonder what they're saying. And just put a little bit of, not much, a little bit of a wrapper. You would be amazed at the difference that makes. What we like to do in our environments is we would take something like that. Tracy and I just made that. I just actually wrote it and put her name on it, and she agreed that I could use her name and she could say whatever I told her to say. I've also done it where we actually had a conversation and take a transcript. So we actually did a real dialogue of explaining things to each other. And we also then like to embed, if we're doing it online, embed a video in it too, either or something else. But again, we like to have multiple forms of presentation, and we like for it to at least have some level of engagement. One of the best ways that you can make those connections is by making your information, especially your key concepts of your information, somehow more engaging, more participatory. Our goal is for students to have agency. And what I mean by that is that they're somehow participating in creating their own learning. Look at all those activities we just did. And every one of them, you were creating something. And it was meaningful if I designed it right and was doing something. And it's really helping you do that. All of a sudden, you're an owner of your education. You're an owner of what you know. And guess what? When you own it, you're going to stay with it. You're going to pay attention to it. If it's because you gave it to me, I have less value, quite honestly. I don't own that. I'm happy not to drop it. It's no big deal. So how do we create this engagement? We try to create that. So even with the form of information. Now, learner agency is the last thing. So I talked about improv and constraint. I talked about presenting information differently. And I could not talk, it would be hard to labor over that one too long. It is one of the things we are up against because we all believe in designing our courses that we have to give this much information. So I would ask you, what percentage of the information that we keep adding more are they really getting? And would it be better if we could get 80% of participation and ownership of a lot less information, or 2% of all the stuff we're doing? I certainly have an answer to that. And I think we can design information and get a lot better on it. So, learner agency, how do we create that? That's very simple. We create activities in which students create. It can be anything. I will give you a couple of examples of things that we did in a course this summer, but literally, these are, we create structures. And again, you see, these aren't graded for right or wrong. These are graded to, can you just try to do something with what you've got, what you've learned. This is the community of practice around instructional design. And so one of the things we were interested in is age, how does it matter? So what is your web history? Could you go back? So we asked people to go back and find themselves on the web. So now these weren't 18-year-old students, right? These were people who were younger than me, but they're somewhere between 40 and 55, et cetera, who were doing this. And they would go back, and so they could use the Wayback Machine. They could go find the first website they'd ever been mentioned in, or the university they worked at, the blog that they posted in 2004. And then they had to create, and you find it, and then you had to create a blog post, or put it somewhere, you could even put it on the left, and do it. And you had to construct that memory and share it with people. What we were getting at is trying to help you see as a designer of information and learning how it makes a difference, how technology's kind of shaped you in your thinking. And so we looked at how, in my case, I was a very active writer on the web, and so it was one thing. But we use this. We have people, even in introductions, using objects and creating stories. When writing stories, we will have them do research things, but always something where it's personal. One of the biggest mistakes we make if we want to create engaged learning is creating an activity where every single person does exactly the same thing, and it can't somehow be owned by the user. Now, when we get to the upper level, we think that's easy because so-and-so's interested. I'm teaching American history, and so-and-so's family is from Salem, Massachusetts, and then I can have them do that. That's kind of personal, but we need to think about it much lower. So when we give so how do we create personalization, ownership, and agency in everything we do? So those are the three ways tools that we can do for. So the last thing is community. So how do we do it in the doer? The biggest problem we have in education is that we don't believe it. We practice that learning starts on September 9th and it ends on December 12th. That is exactly what we practice. And it begins in the beginning of the class, and it ends over here. And one of the things we've always fought against is, well, we need to teach across the curriculum. Why didn't Susie, she took that English comp class last year, and now she's in my political science class, and did you not teach her right? She can't seem to write this paper. No, she learned everything there. But she was taught by our system that when she got out of that class, that was it. Because that's the way it's designed. It ends at the day of the final. There is nothing in here that says you should carry it forward. Now, we tell them to, but there is nothing in the actual design of the system that does that. And so we have to think, how do we create learning that endures? Back to your system. You want people to connect, keep connecting to each other, to information, and beyond. How are we connecting into groups outside of there? We connect them into professional groups, mentor groups, etc., church groups. And then it goes. One of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about next time is communities. How they happen, why they're meaningful. Most of you come from a common church community, we're familiar with that. So we understand our faith drives community. But we also know that you can go to different churches, the community looks different, and it happens different ways. And just because everybody goes to a church, we have the same relationship. And sometimes we have great friendships, and sometimes we don't. And what we learn about systems, for those of you who are science people who talk about the second law of thermodynamics, we know that systems, if there are not both the proper channels for connection between elements of the system, and there isn't a constant infusion of energy into that system, they will go to space. So the question we ask ourselves about learning, and that fourth thing on learning that endures, is what do you do? This is a broader question, not just in your individual classes, but as a learning community to make learning that endures. So you think about those three things: strain exercises, information presentation, and then learner agency in creating things, what are the things that we do as an institution, a department, etc., whether they're challenge competitions, whether they're, and I know that you do study abroad or field exercises in biology, in Central America, those kind of things. What do we do beyond that? How do we make sure that the student who starts here as a freshman but ends as a senior is connected to themselves, to learning, to a spiritual sense that they're growing, and it's not information, it's wisdom by the time they get out, or at least they've got the foundation for that, and that we've taught them how to make connections, we've taught them how to learn, taught them how to get more information. We've given them a whole bunch of people to be. So how many, I'm not good, not show of hands, but how many of us already have a group of satellite communities that our students should already be connected with from the time they're freshmen? And we actually are bringing those in. I'll give one example and I'll close. David North, who teaches computer science at Oklahoma Christian University, is redesigning his computer science class. And this is the program that I just started. And so David said, I don't like the way they're doing that, so I want to do it differently. He's been a practitioner in computer science for 30 years, and he said, we've got to do something better. So he designs 12 principles that all begin with computer science kids should know. That's the freshman group. And they're treating like a cohort, so they're all going through the cohort, and we do that. He said, but that's not enough, they're self-contained. So I want to go and make sure they're getting connected to the juniors and seniors, because I know the juniors and seniors know these 12 concepts, but they know them differently than the freshmen. So I want to design my course so that at certain points in the semester, the juniors and seniors in their courses have to interact with the freshmen, and they have to talk about the same things to different levels and come across the problem. And I'll give the juniors and seniors some participation credit for that. He said, that's better, because now I'm extending, right? You see the community goes beyond those little cohorts. He says, well, now I want to get 30 computer science professionals who graduated as part of our faith tradition, and graduated this year, and now work all over the United States. And I want to get them involved in the class, too. And in certain discussions, it's a face-to-face class with a hybrid and online discussion. And I want to get them involved in certain questions, and I want them to communicate. So now look what's happened. The kid comes in, and she's taking this course, the same thing that we've always taken. Now she's getting perspective. She's talking to people who 2 or 3 years down there looking at getting jobs and see the value. She's engaging with people who are executives and companies and doing that and having real-life conversations. And she's already made connections for employment. She's done this. And all of a sudden, what she's learning means something to her. She's seeing a trajectory. She's seeing a path. She's never sitting in class thinking, man, I can't wait till this is over, because it has meaningful. It's the connection. And they matter. And that's, to me, what student engagement is. It's about thinking of each learner in the middle of that universe, thinking what each of us can do in designing our classes with more information and just the way we present it to help them make one more connection every day. And if that were your goal, you would change the world. I honestly tell you, if each one of you, in every class period, helped every student make one more connection and started creating this centrifugal force for your students, you would really transform everything. Because those students, they imagine every day one more connection, one more meaningful connection. Everybody and every teacher in every class did that. How they start to expand. They start pollinating and spreading seeds all over the world to make changes. That's what our dream is out of a university like this, I would argue. And it's not hard to do, but it takes changing the way we see things, starting small, really understanding that that's how it works. So I thank you very much for listening to me yammer on for so long. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. I know it's like drinking from the fire hose and I talk with that, but it's not the way I would normally like to do this. We could do an all-day workshop where we actually went around and redesigned all of what we're doing in the classes, which is what I like to do. I'm very happy to do that with any of you. I'll put that up there. Because we have time. So that is my email address. You can feel free to email me directly. Dennis certainly Misty have my contact information. I'm more than happy to anytime if you have questions about a specific discipline or something that we do, talk to you personally about that. That's part of my mission in the world to make education better and meaningful, certainly in a spiritual sense, and how we do it and how we make that happen. So I have a special passion for what you do here and willing to support you in any way. haven't been as active in the last month or two because of some work I've been doing, but I'm ramping up again on Monday, so feel free to follow me on Twitter or come with along with us. Yeah. If you have questions, I'm happy to comments about your experience. If you don't have to go. And it's not the mindset that really comes to absolutely. Yeah, so let me, I probably the easiest way, let me put a couple of things together. And I can do that very quickly. I'll send that to you, Misty, and you can disseminate that to everybody, for people who are interested in terms of reading and another product as well as and doing that. But we're still moving forward. I have some really good people.
In that list of materials that you send, if you have any contact info for people who have done it, is there specific that you can contact?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know you don't intend it this way, at least I'm personally just making an assumption.
And it's about something making you look good.
But it could sound like to someone who just listens without drawing an assumption that knowledge and content don't have quite as much to do with each other as you all thought. If there are disciplines, one must know something.
Yes.
Something that must be learned beyond getting people talking to each other.
No, absolutely.
There are still, so if you want to understand crime and punishment, you probably still need to read Crime and Punishment, not just see few key thoughts from time to time.
Absolutely. So let me, that's a very good observation question. Let me kind of clarify my thinking on that. So yes, there is in all of our disciplines, there is a core set, there are a core set of key concepts or core concepts. They would say someone has to learn to have confidence. I really agree with that. Whether I'm teaching literature, literary theory, history, science, it doesn't really matter. There are computer science, there are those things. So the question is, how do we say that the content itself isn't necessarily the thing? So that's one of it. So it's not just the content, it's being able to put pieces of that content together meaningfully in any of our disciplines, and then it's being able to take that and take it further, and that it's not just so it starts out as information, which is kind of useful, but it's just what it is. And developing some competency and expertise around that information and that content that really makes me valuable as a professional, but then taking it even further, and that becomes part of how I see the world, and I grow up and I'm actually better at making decisions and doing things and figuring and helping and all of that. It really kind of moves, that's the normal trajectory I would see for information and content. So, or in that content piece or information and knowledge, the content is the same. We go through it, we develop a greater level of skill and thinking around the content. So the content is always very important, and that kind of doesn't change in that discipline. I still have to go teach different concepts in this is the same. We know that. So I don't want to diminish the content. My argument is there are ways that we can facilitate the helping learners engage with information that makes that trip from kind of just information to just information to knowledge and more internalized and personalized, and then on to things that I think that's to me that's our inner process. That's what makes us unique. That's why we are special and you're special, and that's why students need you. Because if we're not doing that, then a quote I used to have when I wrote it, it's a consultant for state department of education talking to teachers about technology. At the time I wasn't wanting to use them, because a lot of weakness, and somebody said, I'm afraid technology is going to replace it. I said, well, all you're doing is teaching information processing. In other words, here's X piece of information, and you need to take this and do this, then you're right. you can be replaced. If you're teaching people to grow up and grow out with information, that is a tool for doing that, then you're irreplaceable. And so that's certainly a personal philosophy around technology, but I do believe that content is key. The content itself can sometimes be positioned better by publishers and take that from. I think it's us as an instructor then to figure out how do we get those concepts around it and that itself to work digest it in the best way and then internalize and talk. No, I'm really happy that we can.
Thank you.
But no, we never, I mean, again, we'll go back to the example I use of hiring people. I can't hire people for computer science and programming if they don't have very core skills and don't even test. And also the part of the problem solving. And part of the other things that aren't that just core skills. About 50%.
Dr. Reynolds, can I just interject? Real quick, for those that might need to leave or get to another class, thank you for coming today. I'm already trying to think of a way we can do that workshop soon, so we'll really turn. And then also, I've drawn numbers for the prize winners today, and the winners are Dr. Don Bennington, Dr. Brent Montgomery. So I'll let you find over which one. So we have a chargeable battery for smartphone and a wireless speaker. You can use in the shower.
I don't have a smartphone, but I like my own thing. Workout right.
I'm sure the shower that's not safe.
Thank you.
Again, thank you all. I appreciate it.
No, it kind of went.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there it goes. It went under 5%.
Yeah.
Stop broadcasting.
Yes.
Let's go.
That was the one we stop on.